that I started as a visual guide, I guess, to calligraphy for beginners and slightly more proficient practitioners of calligraphy. This was just on the basis that when I learned, I used to learn from a book, and as great as that is as a resource, sometimes it's not very easy to understand how to manipulate the pen to produce some of the letter forms of the trickier scripts. So in this series I will start off with a few of the more common scripts, and then I may move on to illumination, some other scripts, how to modify scripts with your own style and mess around with letter form once you've understood the basics and the key principles, and whatever else comes to mind. Just as a quick disclaimer before we start this episode, I have been practicing calligraphy for 7 years, but I'm not technically a professional by any means, so I may make mistakes here and there. Just go real easy on me there. My main interest is sharing my love of calligraphy with you lovely people, and doing my best to sort of provide a little bit of guidance and make sure that calligraphy can be as fun and easy as possible to learn for any of you who might want to start getting into it. So without any further ado, let's start the episode. So to start off with, I'll be giving you a quick introduction of the key equipment that you'll be needing to start out with calligraphy. So let's start with the nibs. Nibs are what you use obviously to write with. Okay, maybe not so obviously, but these are the key part that holds the ink and transfers it to the paper. So most of them are structured, if you have a look at this Mitchell nib, it's a curved piece of metal that comes to a flat end, which depending on how you hold it or pull it across the paper in terms of direction changes the width of the line that you use. The tip is split, if you can see there. Hopefully it's not too out of focus. It's split into two what are called tines, and that just allows the ink to go out of the pen and onto the paper and just makes it easier. So there's a whole load of different nibs that you can use. These are Mitchell's. Around where I live, these are the cheapest. There are Speedballs, and these differ slightly from Mitchell's in that if you get the reservoir, there's a reservoir at the top there for Speedballs, and they're non-detachable, so you can't take that off. Makes them a bit fiddly to clean, and they take some getting used to, but that's another option you can try. If you have a look at Leonard nibs, they're structured similarly to, they're sort of between the Mitchell style and the Speedball style. They come with a detachable reservoir which you can fit to the top of the nib, and unlike Mitchell nibs, they have a slight oblique angle to the tip, so it's not completely flat. It's slightly diagonal, I guess, and that's just so that it's easier to get the right angle when you're writing with them. But I'll go into that in more detail later. This is just a quick introduction. So moving on, you'll need something to hold the nibs, and those are nib holders, very originally named. So basically they're just a little wooden length that's hollow, and in the middle, if you can see there are 4 little prongs, and basically what you do is you just get your nib and you push it between the ring and where the prongs are, and that'll hold it in while you write. Moving on to a whole lot of other stuff. Oh, they dropped something else. Never mind. Again, just like nibs, nib holders come in a whole range of different styles. So this is one that was made from a reclaimed piece of wood, for example. This is a cheap plastic Speedball one. You'll notice that unlike a lot of the other ones, it has a ring around it that you fit the nib into like that rather than the sort of metal prongs, so that's just a little bit easier to use. And you can get really fancy ones, which is sort of like this pewter one that I have here, or you can just go with the El Cheapo plastic ones. It doesn't really matter which ones you use, it's just what you're comfortable with. In terms of loading your brushes, you can either dunk them straight into the ink or you can use brushes. I recommend using brushes if you want to have more control over how much ink that you use. You can get them in a bunch of sizes. I recommend getting a wide range because if you start doing illumination, you'll start using these more than you'll be using nibs. So we've got very fine ones, which are great for doing detail work, slightly larger ones for putting down layers of colour. The flat-edged ones are brilliant for just putting great big beds of colour on stuff, especially if you're doing stuff like insular calligraphy that has a lot of patches of colour. These huge ones I tend to use if you're doing washes of colour on paper, if you are looking for a different kind of feel or want something to a different colour to put down underneath your calligraphy before you write it out and want to paint up your paper first. Okay, so moving on, I'm going to talk about inks and other means of writing with calligraphy, in terms of what you can use to write calligraphy. Here's a few different brands to have a look at. So there's Winsor & Newton. They do fairly decent stuff. I tend to use theirs the most often just because it's my personal preference, but feel free to shop around. There's no such thing as the right ink, inverted commas if you will. So this is drawing ink. There's also specific calligraphy ink that Winsor & Newton make that you can try if you like. It's personal preference. The only thing I would say is don't use stuff that's waterproof unless you're being very careful, and don't use anything acrylic based because they will gum up your nibs and you'll have a very bad time. Stuff like this is also good. Pigmented ink, so this is Art Spectrum brand. I'm not quite sure what this is, but it's more or less similar. This is a purple ink. In terms of pricing, this will go for about $10 in Australia, at least where I bought it. This is closer to 20, and this is closer to about 10 as well. So it really depends on the brand and how much you get relative to how much you pay. Just have a shop around and try them out because there's a whole range that you can use. Also, gouache is a great option to look at. I personally love gouache because it dries matte. You can dial in the opacity because unlike watercolor, gouache has sort of a watercolor base but contains something called Fuller's Earth, and what that does is it makes it less transparent than watercolor, so it's opaque, which is fantastic if you're looking for an alternative to ink. It's also really good for laying down color if you're doing illumination, but again you can also use watercolor for that. But if that's what you want to have a look at, I cannot recommend gouache highly enough. And then finally, watercolor. So obviously these are very, very well used, but these are pretty typical pans. I forget how much these go for. It really depends again on brand. These are just student quality, I guess. You can get them in tubes, much like you can with gouache. You know, if you're familiar with art stores and stuff, you've seen them around. I won't go into too much more detail there. And then I guess that's about it in terms of using the pens. I store my pens in the strangest things that I don't know why I keep them in that specimen jar. Yeah. Next up, I'll just quickly show you the paper that you can use. So, it's a whole range of papers that you can use. So this is just a jumbo pack of watercolour paper. It's 200 GSM, which is grams per square metre. I'm not sure what that is in pounds, so apologies to my non-metric using friends. Again, range of sizes, so that's A3. These are both slightly larger than A4. Again, it's down to personal preference. In terms of how thick you want the paper, I highly recommend using at least higher than maybe 100 GSM, purely because I find that they tend to buckle when you use the ink if you have the paper that's too thin. Again, experiment with different brands, see what works for you. I personally use 300. Some people might say that that's too heavy, but I just am a little bit terrified of having my paper crinkle when I use it, and I tend to do a lot of watercolour washes, and I prefer having that extra sort of fallback, I guess. Now just quickly moving on before I finish to some more stuff that you can get if you want. If you don't want to use it, or it's too expensive, or whatever reason, don't. These are kind of, I guess, what you'd call luxury items. So this is ink cleaner. Technically you can just clean nibs with water and soap or detergent. This I tend to use purely because it's really good at getting more stubborn inks out, or if you've accidentally left your ink in your nib overnight and you have to rinse it out. So just get like a I guess, what is it, Americans call them Q-tips, we call them cotton buds, and you just dip it in there and you clean out your nibs with that. Again, up to you if you get that. I personally just use it because it's good in a pinch. Otherwise you can just use soap and water. These are plastic pipettes. Now, as you can see by the horrible marking on this, these are great for, and as an alternative to paintbrushes, if you want something that you can load your nibs with. So you would get your nib, oh, nearly lost the reservoir, and then just depending on which nib type it is, load it from under the reservoir there or underneath the nib, and it's just a little bit more precise, I guess, than pens. Paintbrushes. Really depends on how you work. But yeah, that's another thing that you can look at. Yeah. Finally, I just wanted to show you this because it's a cool little toy, and it's actually very, very helpful for some things that I'll be showing you later on in other episodes. This is called a light pad. If you've done art and used this before, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about, but basically it's just a strip of LED bulbs inside a sheet of plastic, and this version has a USB connection that you can either connect to a computer or to like one of those charger port type things that plug into a power board or other electrical source. But when you plug it in, you can use that to have, say for example, guidelines. So this is just a set of guidelines that I printed off the internet, which I use when I'm practicing. And then when you have your paper, so this is ordinary printing paper, which again you can use with practicing, and you can see the lines underneath, and then you take the paper off and they're gone. And it's fantastic. It saves you a hell of a lot of time in terms of ruling up your lines and then trying to erase them without smudging your ink later or waiting for your ink to dry. So it's very handy. Up to you whether you do that or whether you prefer to rule your lines. I'll be showing you how to rule the lines in later episodes anyway, so you can choose which one to do, because as I said, this is more of a luxury item. But I highly recommend, if you're looking into later stuff, so in later episodes when I do designing illumination, for example, or I'll be doing a few demonstrations of work I do, I'll probably be using this. So that's the introduction to the main gear. Hopefully I've covered everything. If I haven't, I'm sure I'll bring up new pieces of gear to use in later episodes, either if I've forgotten something or if I found something cool that I'll recommend you experimenting with. But yeah, have a hunt around, gather your materials, and in the next episode I'll be looking at unseal, our first hand, and I'll be showing you how to write unseal and how to rule out the lines and all that kind of thing. And so look forward to see you guys then.